So there's recently been this old beef that's kind of just resurfaced, or this old drama, and that is between Demetrious Johnson and Dana White. Now, I sewed off like part of the thumbnail a few days ago, and I said Demetrious Johnson is the forgotten GOAT. And somebody said in the comments section, I'm sorry if I cannot remember your name, but he said, how is he forgotten if most people put them on their top 3 of all time? That's a valid point, but what I mean by that is the UFC... Demetrious Johnson is one of the few fighters that the UFC is actively trying to get you to forget about. They bring him up as least as they possibly can. Whenever a UFC fighter has a higher record than he does, even when they don't have a higher record when he just ties it, they will market that to the ends of the earth. Because if you actually knew how many records Demetrious Johnson has at flyweight, and the records that they are, these aren't like most decision wins, like those kind of backhanded records. No. These are like win streaks, title defense records, most strikes thrown, control time, submissions, like those type of records, okay? Demetrious Johnson either has them or he's in the top 3. Let me give you the brief rundown of this quick drama. Timestamps are going to be down below. You can skip ahead if you don't feel like hearing this. But this is going to be my rant of the video, just to give you a quick story time. Okay, so this is when the UFC went from its golden age into the mainstream era. Or golden age to star era, we have different names for it. So this was in between the GSP Anderson Silva era, going into Conor McGregor and Ronda Rousey. People understand that. During this time, there was a lot of UFC fighters that were at the height of their powers, that because of the marketing machine that the UFC had with Conor McGregor and Ronda Rousey, they kind of were swept under the rug. That is the brutally honest thing. Tony Ferguson's career was ruined more by Conor than any other UFC fighter. But one division that suffered more than any other division in the UFC was flyweight. And listen, I have been critical of flyweight. I've had polls on my channel, my community polls, talking about should the UFC end the flyweight division. I'm not saying they should. But I'm saying if we're going to cut a division, it probably should be flyweight. Flyweight is probably as weak as it's ever has been. Like, it's just not that good. I mean, you could justify putting top-ranked Steve Erceg against Pantoja, and nobody's really talking any shit, except for me, because that's crazy. But everybody else is kind of meh, so it works out. But at this time, flyweight was kind of in its golden age. You had your Henry Cejudo, you had your Mighty Mouse. You had a fairly solid division. But Demetrious Johnson was dominating flyweight to the point that nobody really cared about the division. As much as people like to throw the egg on Dana White's face here, and don't get me wrong, I'm going to be roasting Dana White later on in this video. But at this time, I remember the comment sections. I remember people talking about Demetrious Johnson like, yeah, he's good, but he's a manlet. Yeah, like that was the discussion around flyweight. It's like, yeah, they're good fighters, but they're 125 pounds. People did not take the division really seriously because of it. It sucks, and I don't care if you hate me in the comment section. People still say this to this day. And when you're in a market that you have to pay pay-per-views, you have to sell pay-per-views, public opinion is the only thing that really matters. It just does. And don't get me wrong, now flyweight is kind of getting a little bit better. People are still saying that, but to a lesser degree. Back then, everybody said it. Even Dana White did. I believe don't quote me on this, but I remember an interview Dana White said, and he said, flyweight is just Demetrious Johnson whooping a bunch of manlets. It was something funny like that. And he wasn't wrong. It really was. Demetrious Johnson was so dominant at flyweight, it made flyweight look like a joke. He was hitting highlight reel KOs like he was fighting amateurs, but these are professional fighters. So what happened? Demetrious Johnson, at the height of his powers, with 12 title defenses, defended the belt 13 times. Wait, 13 times. 13 title fights, okay? He has an undefeated streak of 12 fights. It was something like that. Wanted pay-per-view points. Now, that's a logical thing to say. Demetrious Johnson was asking for pay-per-view points when he had the title defenses. He's not going to sell many. I'm sorry, that's the truth. But he wanted pay-per-view points. He can ask for that. And Dana White refused it. Okay? And not just refused it. He said that he offered Demetrious Johnson a fight with TJ Dillashaw, and if he didn't accept it, they were going to cut the entirety of the flyweight division. Imagine if that happened now. Imagine if Pantoja was offered a fight against O'Malley, and if he said no to it, they were going to end the entirety of flyweight. Demetrious Johnson agreed to the fight with TJ Dillashaw, never really materialized. It just didn't. That was kind of a weird era in MMA. So, he agrees to the fight, and they don't cut flyweight. Demetrious Johnson is the only reason the flyweight division is still around today. After 12 title defenses, no pay-per-view points, they threaten to cut the division. He beats people there. He beats Henry Cejudo, beats all the top guys at that division. But Bantamweight gets all the marketing dollars because they have the TJ Dillashaw, Dominic Cruz, Cody Garbrandt, and Team Alpha Male kind of being like the marketing power behind that division. And that just trumped everything that flyweight was doing with Demetrious Johnson and Henry Cejudo. So what happens next? Demetrious Johnson loses the rematch to Henry Cejudo, and the UFC is over the fucking moon that somebody was finally able to beat Demetrious Johnson. And they do something that they have never done and will probably never do again, sadly. They traded an MMA fighter. Now, a lot of people get this twisted. They think that Demetrious Johnson didn't get paid. No, the UFC paid out the entirety of Demetrious Johnson's contract. Every fight that he could have fought, they paid him for it. Okay? They paid him for all those fights just for him to leave. Because he made the division look pathetic. Because he was so good. Now somebody was finally able to beat him. They aren't going to give him the trilogy fight. Instead, they trade him over for Ben Askren from ONE FC. Now, what they didn't realize is that Demetrious Johnson was going to... I would argue ONE FC has a better flyweight division. I understand it's not flyweight, but you see what I mean. They traded him for Ben Askren, and a lot of people will look at that and be like, I bet they wish they did. No, they would do that 100%. They would do it again 100 times over. Because let me tell you something. Ben Askren wasn't the star that they thought he was going to be. But with no Ben Askren, there would have been no Jorge Masvidal. Now, understand the Ben Askren trade is a success in the UFC's book because they were able to get Masvidal, and let's play the butterfly effect, okay? Or domino effect, one of those. Demetrious Johnson being traded by the UFC led to Justin Gaethje having the BMF title. The real ones are going to know why, but understand that that was the domino effect that took place. The UFC does see it as a huge success. 100% they still wish they had Demetrious Johnson, because Demetrious Johnson goes on to be a Hall of Famer in ONE FC, but isn't a UFC Hall of Famer. And this is where I'm going to shit on Dana White. Demetrious Johnson is still not a UFC Hall of Famer. Despite him being the undeniable GOAT of the flyweight division. He is. Let's go look at some stats, shall we? Total fights. Joseph Benavidez is the ranking number 1. Demetrious Johnson's number 5 with 15. Demetrious Johnson is in the top 5 to number 1 of just about every stat here. Demetrious Johnson is tied for number 1 to Joseph Benavidez, but they made sure to put Joseph above Demetrious Johnson because they can't be marketing Demetrious too much because he's fighting for their rival organization. If they could, they would erase Demetrious Johnson from this list. 13 wins at the division. Finishes. Demetrious Johnson holds the record. Davison Figueiredo is also tied at number 1, but he's no longer fighting at the division. Keep in mind, this was years ago. Is this the only one? Let me see. KO wins. This is the only one where Demetrious Johnson isn't in the top 5. He has 2 tied at 7 with all these other dudes. Submission wins. Demetrious Johnson leads with number 5, beating out Mohamed Mokaev and Alessandro Pantoja. I do believe Mokaev is going to lead, I will say that. Decision wins. Demetrious Johnson's number 3. Win streak is 13. Win streak is 13. That is absolutely wild. He lost one fight to Henry Cejudo, and they kicked him out of the UFC because they were worried that he was going to beat Henry Cejudo again, and the Henry Cejudo fight was pretty close. He probably would have won a trilogy. Win streak is 13. And this is my favorite stat. I quote this stat all the time, but I really do need to tell you this. Title fight wins, Demetrious Johnson has 12. If you totaled everybody else together, you get 10. Every single champion that came after Demetrious Johnson, take all their title defenses together, it is still less than Demetrious Johnson. Mighty Mouse is the GOAT of flyweight, and it's not even close. Total fight night bonuses, 9. This one, shortest fight average, this is kind of a weird one. I'm sorry, it really is. Longest average fight time, 18 minutes and 37 seconds. Total fight time, 4 hours. Control time, 1 hour. Muhammad Mokaev finally beats him out, and they won't stop marketing Muhammad Mokaev for this, because it's one of the few things he does beat Demetrious Johnson in. Control time percentage. Top position time, however, he beats him out there with 1 hour and 5 minutes. Top percentage, again, percentage is a weird one. 13 seconds for Henry Cejudo is actually kind of crazy. Cejudo has a few records. But Demetrious Johnson is about in every single one. Significant strikes landed, 1,059. Beats out Brandon Moreno. Accuracy, number 2. Barely loses to CJ Vergara. Like, the point I'm trying to make here is Demetrious Johnson holds more records in the division than any other champion or fighter that came after him. But they aren't going to call him the GOAT because he fights for ONE FC. Now, I guess the little silver lining is that there's so much fan uproar because now Demetrious Johnson, now that he's out of the UFC, people won't stop talking about him, and I do like that. However, I would have appreciated it when he was fighting. They're kind of forced to put him in the Hall of Fame when he eventually retires, which is probably going to be in the next couple of years. His longevity is also insane. But Dana White doesn't do himself any favor, because he talks about how Demetrious Johnson never asked for any pay-per-view buys. That is a lie. I'm sorry. I could say very confidently that is a lie. Demetrious Johnson says that a lie, and I do trust Demetrious Johnson more than I trust Dana White, because it makes more. It would be weird for me if he didn't ask for pay-per-views. You threaten to end the entirety of the division because he was so dominant. And when he finally lost to Henry Cejudo in the rematch, you kicked him out of the UFC because you were worried he was going to win the title again and make that division unmarketable. I understand why they did it, and you got to understand why they did it too, for it to make sense. But when we're lying about it after the fact, that's where it becomes a problem. Demetrious Johnson is the forgotten GOAT because he's the only he is the only dude that I would call the GOAT of a division that the UFC is actively trying to erase. People talk about how the UFC is trying to erase Francis Ngannou. Francis Ngannou was never in the running to be the best heavyweight of all time. He has 1 title defense. He's not in the running. He just isn't. He beat Stipe. That's about it. GSP. GSP is the only other dude you can make the case against, but they'll celebrate GSP. There is almost no marketing for Demetrious Johnson, and Demetrious Johnson is the clear GOAT of flyweight, and they will actively lie about it. But because Demetrious Johnson is fighting for a rival organization, people aren't going to see these interviews. His YouTube channel, unironically, is saving his career right now because people are advocating for him. People like Joe Rogan are advocating that he be in the GOAT Hall of Fame, the MMA Hall of Fame. And he should. This is just my little Demetrious Johnson rant. I've let this slip in other videos talking about how I think Demetrious Johnson is one of the best fighters of all time. One of the best fight IQs, great striking, great grappling. One of the few true martial artists I've seen in the sport. However, isn't in the Hall of Fame. I decided to make a dedicated video to it because some people are talking about it now. And I say, why not? I'll talk about it. Tell me what you think in the comment section down below. What do you think about Demetrious Johnson? What do you think about the trade that the UFC pulled off? Do you think it was a success? And if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, hit the bell icon. Really helps me in the algorithm. And with that out of the way, adios, guys.